Hello, and welcome to the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute. I'm Dan Paff, a senior fellow. At the center, we focus on the intersection of concepts, ideas about how to defend a nation, and technology that might enable these ideas. And I can't think of a better duo to engage in a discussion at this intersection than our guest today. We have Michele Flournoy, who's the co-founder and managing partner of West Exec Advisors. She was also co-founder of CNAS, as well as a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. We also have Mike Brown, who's a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, a former CEO of Symantec, and also a former director of Pentagon's Defense Innovation Unit. And these two recently co-authored an article in Foreign Affairs titled "Time is Running Out to Defend Taiwan." And our discussion today is going to explore some of the ideas in this article. And if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to do so. So to dive into the discussion here, in the opening paragraphs of the article, you cite the 22 National Defense Strategy. It like the defense strategy before it, calls for more speed in deterring aggression with special attention to the People's Republic of China over the possible aggression in the Indo-Pacific. Can you set the stage for this? Can you describe your own sense of urgency around the scenario? Why does the department need to take action quickly? And why do you feel the need to, that maybe the department should change course? So Michele, let's start with you. How can you help us frame the urgency here?
So, I think a lot of the departments, I think the defense strategy is absolutely spot on. It identifies China as the pacing threat. It recognizes the problem. But I think when you look at the implementation of that strategy, the bulk of the department's investments around China will come to fruition in the 2030s. These are longer term programs. And what worries me is that Xi Jinping may perceive a window of opportunity before then. So right now, granted, he's got his hands full with a failed COVID policy, an economy in decline, the 20th Party Congress to consolidate his political power. He'd obviously prefer to solve the Taiwan problem as he sees it, without the resort to force, using political coercion or economic envelopment, and just get Taiwan to believe it has no other option than to reunify. But what worries me is that he has specifically instructed the PLA to be ready by 2027. He has clearly communicated again and again that he sees this as a legacy issue, something that he is determined to accomplish on his watch, whatever it takes. And given our transparent democracy, if he sees and understands that the U.S. posture in the region and our capabilities for deterring and defeating Chinese aggression are going to get much, much stronger in the 2030s, my worry is that he could decide to move more quickly and make that 2027 timeline not just a goal to be ready, but a time to contemplate action before it gets more difficult for him. So that's kind of the premise of our thinking. And if that's true, the Department of Defense needs to be doing a whole lot more to improve our capability in that time frame than we are currently doing.
Mike, over to you. What are your?
Yep. Yeah, well, I think I would just add two things. One, I've just finished reading a book that just came out called The Danger Zone by Hal Brands and Michael Beckley. And be meeting with them tonight at dinner. Their premise is really that the danger period for a conflict with China is right around the corner, the years 2024 to 2027. And for the reasons that Michele cited, she may perceive a window of opportunity that is closer than we think. And if we think about our own preparedness, many of the capabilities that we are working on in the Defense Department come to fruition a decade from now. So they don't line up. So we may need to be a little more scrappy than we are being in using technology that's available today and crafting a more agile response that really deters China. So if we think about that, that really implies commercial technology and doing some things that we've not been particularly good at, being agile at the Department of Defense and adopting commercial technology more widely. So I really see the sense of urgency around what are we doing that creates that element of surprise and further deters Xi from thinking this is his window of opportunity.
In my reading of your article, the central theme, the thing that really excites me, is this idea of, not only is there maybe a need in this 2 to 5 year window that you talk about, there's a sense of urgency there, but depending how you view it, there's also a tremendous opportunity in that window. If we think about, my understanding, our primary levers of action for deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, we think a lot about this lever one, which is maybe more capacity that's flowed through the theater, and the department has processes like its global force employment process where it can push more capacity out if it need to. It can surge or raise the baseline. And then, you've hinted at this other lever as well. There are service modernization plans where there will be new weapons coming online with new technology and more capability. Some of those come online in 5 years, some come on 10, and some are still before in the requirements planning process. And those are flowed through, of course, our conventional requirements and acquisition processes. But we think about that, these two levers. You're really arguing that there's another set of levers. There's these opportunities that we're not exploiting, right? There's this rich tapestry in the middle. And before we give some anecdotes about what those might be or how that might work, Michele, I was wondering if you can reflect on this gap. I mean, has this gap always been there? Has it been there since Goldwater Nichols, and where does it come from?
There is a gap in terms of authorities and responsibilities. Service chiefs are given, and service secretaries, the organize and train and equip Title 10 function. And that tends to push them thinking more into the future, given the long development and procurement timelines that we typically experience. So they're focused on the 2030s and beyond. The COCOMs, combatant commanders, they're in the here and now. What do I do tomorrow? I'm doing a freedom of navigation operation tomorrow. I'm doing a port visit the next week. It is current operations. But there's really no one who is empowered and in charge in this middle period that we're talking about that is so urgent. And that's where you have to have senior leadership step in and, put some people in charge and really empower them to move forward. And the problem is not so much coming up with new things faster, new capabilities faster. The timeline is such that realistically, you're going to work with what you have or what is about either in hand or coming in hand. And you got to put it together in new ways, potentially cross service in a joint way or cross domain to get a new outcome or to solve a particular operational problem. So what we talked about in the article is, start by putting someone in charge, survey and catalog and prioritize the most urgent operational challenges that we've got to solve to be able to effectively deter. And then, then it's like an Apollo 13 effort, shake out the bag of all the stuff on the table, see what you got to work with, and start putting it together in new ways to try to solve your urgent problem. That is the kind of effort that's needed. And it may be happening in little pockets on the margins because by smart, dedicated people, but it is not really organized, incented, structured, resourced as a main effort by the department at this point.
Yeah, I think Michele is spot on with that. That from my time as the director of Defense Innovation Unit, we're not taking advantage of what's in front of us through the commercial market, commercial technologies available today because of what she described. The responsibilities and authorities really come from decades ago when the department invented most of what it needed. If you go back to the McNamara era, we were probably inventing 80% of what we needed. But today that's flipped. Today the department is inventing about 20% of what it needs. So if it's AI, if it's cyber, if it's autonomous systems, that's happening. That in the commercial world, that's being developed. And if we're not taking advantage of what is already being developed, we're not equipping our warfighters with the best. For years, there was the search for a third offset, or what's the asymmetric advantage that we're going to have that our adversaries don't, like we had when we first had the capability of nuclear weapons. And I think what we found in that exercise was now technology diffuses globally so rapidly that there's probably not going to be a technology that we have that the Chinese don't have. So the premium is on agility. And this was recognized in the last version of the National Defense Strategy in 2018. But the question is, okay, true enough, how well are we executing on that agility? And it's just what Michele said with that Apollo 13 kind of mentality. How do we scan what's available now commercially, bring that to bear, equip our warfighters with it, and come up with some new concepts that basically would be a surprise to the Chinese? They've stolen some of the designs of our major weapons platforms, particularly our aircraft. They've watched our ConOps now for decades. They know exactly how we come to the fight. And we need more of an element of surprise. We need more scrappiness. We need more agility, just what the strategy called for. That's what I see we're not putting into place.
Yeah. And if I could just jump in, Dan, I apologize. If we had control over how to title the foreign affairs article, it would have been, we're running out of time to deter China. I mean, the truth is the Apollo 13 problem is deterring China. We have to figure out ways of causing President Xi to doubt whether he can pull it off. And that involved, there's developing a whole kit bag of things that we could conceal and then reveal to really surprise him, make him doubt, whether it's doubting the competency of his own forces or causing him to increase his estimation of our forces. But deterrence is the name of the game here. And yes, there is a political resolve piece and a diplomatic piece and all of that, but there is also be careful what you wish for. If you get into this, it will be very costly and you will likely not succeed. And that it's a narrower problem than, that I think helps focus the mind on the kinds of concepts that we're talking about.
Yeah.
I just want to add that if I can, because I think Michele is so right here. If we look at Ukraine as an example, we didn't deter Putin, and we were able to take some time. Fortunately, it wasn't too late to provide the Ukrainians with equipment, but that's really come on as a stream, and it's much easier to supply Ukraine than it would be to supply an island, 5,000-6,000 miles away. And then the Allies came together as a result of Putin's miscalculation and marching into Ukraine. She will probably learn from that and figure out, okay, the key is the first 24, 72 hours. So we have to do the thinking to deter him so he doesn't think that's a good gamble. So it's going to unfold differently if it happens than we had time to react in Ukraine. So that's why we feel this sense of urgency. The clock is ticking. We've got to do it differently this time if we want to deter China.
Look, I think this is important. This is actually aligns with my current central theme of research. Look, the department has to be prepared for a potential military invasion of Taiwan. Were that to come, the department must have a set of plans. But assuming that latching decision has not yet been made, then this current period is in a critical time to try to dissuade that action, to try to drive uncertainties and try to drive doubt. And Michele, as you pointed out, being able to generate surprise, an inventory or factory for surprise, being able to produce that on demand is, of course, a powerful way to be able to drive this uncertainty. And there isn't the time or maybe even the budget to sort of do that in a very conventional, laborious weapons development process. But if we could combine what we have and combine commercial technologies and combine new operational concepts together, it opens up this explosive factorial world of things that we could do. And that feels like a powerful tool to drive doubt.
Absolutely. And so it's not just the tools and the concepts, it is actually a strategy that tried to get inside the Beijing's calculus on what would we reveal, what would we conceal, how would we, reveal some of this to have the maximum impact on that calculus. And that's a really hard problem because back in the Cold War, we had a whole cottage industry of people who were trying to understand the Soviet calculus. We are in the early days of really trying to understand Xi and the Chinese calculus.
Yeah. But there's this duality too there, where presumably it's not just about the shell game of showing surprise, it's about capability. And in your article, I mean, you spend time talking about how Ukraine is able to improvise using commercial satellite imagery and off-the-shelf drones and computing devices to build out sensing and targeting and situational awareness tools. And it sounds kind of like a bargain basement version of a precision strike complex. But interestingly, presumably there weren't these long requirements processes building it out. There weren't mandatory data standards. There was just an existential threat facing them down, these operational challenges in front of them, like precision strike of beyond visual range ground targets. And it's really from that bottoms up that they built it, right? It's not a puzzle that they're trying to piece together with these intricate interfaces. It's much more like building a mosaic out of the available tiles. And it feels really scrappy. It's a pickup game. Mike, can you tell us how that meshes with your vision of a fast follower strategy?
Sure. Well, the fast follower strategy is really about how do we adopt commercial technology more quickly. And it really is a reaction to the requirements process that I've observed at the Defense Department last 6 years. So if we think about it, requirements is an eminently logical process. And it really says, I will tell you as the market, the defense primes or other defense suppliers, what I would like you to build for me. If you know exactly what you need, if you've invented the technology along with some of those companies, that can make a lot of sense. But now, as we talked about before, the world's flipped. 80% of what we need is coming from commercial suppliers, not necessarily from the defense enterprise world. So again, AI, autonomous systems, cyber tools, things like that. It's an extreme arrogance to think we can, at the Department of Defense, define what we would need and ask exactly for that. Instead, we shouldn't use that process. We should do what the commercial world does when it thinks about what it needs for the future. It doesn't try and predict the future, which is what the requirements process does, but it says, I got to live in an unpredictable world, one that's changing rapidly. So I got to take advantage of what's out there and come up with the best capability. So fast follower strategy is exactly that. Without thinking about requirements, what's out there that could meet my operational needs? And how do I assess that? How do I start experimenting with that and putting new operational concepts together? And how do I acquire and adopt that in a rapid fashion? It basically leverages what the commercial world is doing in terms of its selection process and adoption process. So that's what I think we need to basically create this, third lever, as you described it, Dan, this one that goes between the very long-term capabilities that we want to develop. And Michele and I in no way would say we need to stop that. No, we need to continue that long-term effort, or the force, posture, surging forces. That's clearly an important lever for us. And we've been trying to, for years, shift the balance to Indo-PACOM. That should clearly continue. But this is a third lever that we need to take advantage of. And the fast follower strategy would help us do that. Bring capabilities into the department in 1 to 2 years instead of 1 to 2 decades. It takes 9 to 26 years on average to bring a new capability in the Defense Department. So that's great if we have that time, but of course, what we're making the argument here is we may not have that amount of time with Taiwan. So we really need to rethink how can we make that third lever a part of our strategy.
Yeah, Michele, though, this sounds scrappy, right? It sounds like an underdog play, and that's not usually my mental model of how the Pentagon likes to work, right? There's a comfort zone around operating from positions of strength, of positions of even dominance. How do you see that? What is the role for this more scrappy approach? Is there historical precedent for it? How do you see this?
I think there are a couple of things that need to happen. One is there's plenty of precedent for services allowing for sort of mini insurgencies, scrappy alternative thinkers to exist within the broader service. I mean, think of carrier aviation in the Navy before World War II. It was sort of seen as like, these people don't understand. They don't get it. The battleship is king. That's what's going to define, naval dominance in the future. But thank God the Navy didn't squash them, because it turned out what they were doing in this little insurgency became a big deal and helped us win that war. And you can find, examples in other parts of. I won't rehearse. I'm not a military historian, but I won't rehearse a lot of examples. But that is really important. So the first thing is, I would like to see each of the service. I'd like to see us identify the most urgent operational needs and problems that we need to solve. Here are the top whatever number of priorities. Then I'd like each of the services to take some of their best and brightest and say, you guys go after this. How would you do this from our service perspective? And even better if you can collaborate with some of your brothers and sisters in other services to come up with a joint approach. And have a forum where those scrappy ideas are brought forward to the OSD level. And then try to convince Congress. Again, this is the job of the secretary and the deputy and OSD. Convince Congress that this is an urgent problem. If something is a joint urgent operational need and it is not adequately solved or funded, we need your help in allowing us to reprogram monies to solve that problem. So these are going to become SecDef sponsored priorities for the service POMs and budgets, and the services are going to have to make room for them because these are the priorities for deterrence in the next 2 to 5 years. So there may be other ways to skin the cat. That's just one approach, but you have to have the scrappiness to get the innovation and find the solutions, but then you've got to have senior level sponsorship to drive it in to the resource allocation of the department, or else the antibodies and the services will come out and kill the scrappy efforts and just say, that was an interesting science. We're not funding that. You don't understand our priorities.
Maybe if I can just give two quick examples of what I think Michele is talking about. One very relevant for Ukraine, which was what can we learn from different sensors in space? So VIU several years ago started working with manufacturers of synthetic aperture radar. So most of the images we see from space are optical. We're used to looking at very sophisticated cameras, but this is actually a radar image. And the technology improved such that you could see resolution on those radar images down to 1/3 of a meter or 1 foot. So you basically can make out any object, certainly tanks or ships or anything like that, through those radar images. And importantly, you can see through clouds and at night because it's radar. So this was critical to getting a much better picture of what was happening both before the Russians invaded and then after they did. If I'm looking at a truck convoy outside Kiev, now I know what I might need to do if I'm on the Ukrainian side. So absolutely critical. We didn't have that as a normal capability within DoD because we didn't know how to buy that commercial satellite imagery. We're used to owning these assets ourselves, government satellites. By the end of this decade, it's going to be 1,000 commercial satellites for every government satellite. So we better figure out how we're using that capability. Because it's commercial, our adversaries are going to have that capability. The Chinese are also putting up lots of these sensors in space or satellites in low Earth orbit. So a brand new capability gives us so much more situational awareness, really coming to the forefront in the Ukraine conflict. And it was only that conflict that forced the decision of who in the department is going to be responsible for that commercial satellite imagery. So now in NRO, there's an office that is responsible for buying that commercial satellite imagery. Before that, it was a jump ball. No one knew who was supposed to buying it, so there's no budget for it. All the things that Michele alluded to before that are the obstacles to creating that. I'll give you another example where I think it is working, again, on a small scale to what Michele talked about rather than being broadly applied. That's Task Force 59 in the Navy. And what Task Force 59 is doing is experimenting with all of the autonomous platforms to try and get a common picture from sensors that might be around a manned craft on the water. So if you think about the vast distances of the Pacific, one of the issues is, and one of the reasons people are talking about how can we get to a 350 or larger Navy is we got to cover vast distances to be able to sense what's going on, to understand the situational awareness. So in addition to what's going on in space, we need some of those assets, on the ground. So Task Force 59 is experimenting with autonomous capability in the air, on the surface. So There are sailing vehicles that are autonomous, and then undersea, and putting that together in a network of what does all that sensor information tell me? A great way to cover the distances in the Pacific when I'm not going to be able to do that with manned vessels. So that's happening today, really not only experimenting with what those sensors and the platforms are, but how do I pull that together in a network of data so I got better situational awareness and can make better decisions. So that's a great example of what we need to be doing more of in the department.
Yeah. You know, Mike, when you talk about using commercial technology, you know, I think it's often easy to get in this mental trap of like replacing a like system with another like system. And, you know, if we imagine some capable, you know, unmanned aircraft system like the MQ-4B, the Triton, right, has very highly capable sensor suites and radio suites. You're not going to replace that with a commercial drone, and it would be really easy, you know, for people to be dismissive of this idea of leveraging, you know, commercial computing or commercial satellites, because I view it from the sense of requirements. It's like those aren't going to last for 30 years. Those don't necessarily meet this standard, and it feels like those aren't serious. Those don't really meet my need. How do you view this? Does this complement that? Is there another way to be thinking about this?
Yeah, it's not an either or proposition. So in no way am I saying throw out all your large weapons platforms and let's see what we can do with commercial technology. There is a definite need for the incredibly sophisticated capability we bring with Columbia-class submarines or F-35s. But we should be complementing that. Our defense budget is not infinite, as we know. We got to complement that with some lower cost capability, some that's attritable, because we know we're going to be, if we're in a conflict with China, some of our capability is going to be taken out. You're with a peer competitor now. It's not going to be like a conflict with Iraq or something like that. So you've got to be resilient. So thinking of an architecture that has many more sensors and capabilities deployed, some of which is attritable, that's unmanned, as we talk about lower cost. So those are the kind of things we need to complement the large weapons platforms with. In fact, Admiral Selby of the Office of Naval Research and I call this a hedge strategy. We've got to hedge the large platforms with some of these complementary capabilities that we bring. So again, not an either or. We need to think about how do we bring some of these other capabilities to the fight.
Yeah. There's also this dimension of what you're talking about that isn't just material. I mean, you're not just talking about, you know, here's a big pile of commercial equipment and computing and pushing it forward. You're mixing development and operations. And I'm certainly struck by the analogy, right? In modern software development has much of it has moved to this model that mixes development and operations because your priorities may shift when integration is really your key risk. Integrating those things together to drive quality of service, you know, those are motivations for DevOps methodologies. I'm curious, Michele, when we're talking about, it's not just the commercial technologies, it's the operational concepts that go with them, which are going to create the surprise. And presumably, if we are focused on the Indo-Pacific, a lot of those operations are going to be joint, where I'm going to need to mix personnel from multiple services who do not on a day-to-day basis practice operations or think of new operational concepts. It's like it's not just the technology, there's also these joint new tactics, joint new operational concepts that I'm co-developing with the technology. So my question to you, Michele, is, I mean, are there authorities issues associated with that? I typically think about those as stovepipe activities, development and operations.
They are generally stovepipe, but I think within the services you see more and more examples of, particularly with emerging technologies that are using a more agile development process, where the operators are getting to be part of the iterative cycle. So they get to play with something, they use it, they say, I like this about it, I don't like this about it, can you change this, can you alter that? And they're part of that development cycle. I think from a joint perspective, one of the organizations that probably does it best is SOCOM, because they have the service-like authorities to do the acquisition and integration, and then they have the COCOM responsibilities. And so the place where I've seen it work best is with joint teams across the special operations world, really being part of that, code of being partners in the development and refinement of a product. But even there, more often than not, it's actually done by a service component within SOCOM. So it's either Naval Special Warfare leading or Army Special Operations Forces leading, and so forth. So it is challenging, but I think again, it's something that needs to be encouraged and incentivized to happen more if we're going to get to where we need to go.
I think your question, Dan, and Michele is teasing this out, really points to 3 areas where we could learn from what the commercial sector is doing. One is end user feedback. So that's exactly how it would be talked about in a development context in any tech company, is we need to talk with the end user, the warfighter, to understand whether what we develop really meets the needs. So the tighter you can make that loop from talking to the warfighter and making sure that gets incorporated in what you're developing, the less likely you're to have something that just sits on the shelf. And we've heard some examples of new capabilities they get that they don't want to use because their input wasn't taken into account. So that end user feedback and rapid iteration is something that the commercial market is doing every day. Another concept is interoperability. So if you're talking about operating across joint forces, and think about with allies, the way we're going to really make sure we deter China and Taiwan is to have them know that we're working closely with allies, not just if they invade, then we're going to pull allies together, but show that up front as part of the deterrence strategy. What better way to show that interoperability than work with commercial technology that's not classified? We could be making that a part of our exercises today. The more commercial technology we use, the more widely it can be deployed across our allies. And then the third concept is speed. If we go back to the defense strategy of 2018, and it's calling for the fact that we need agility because we're unlikely to have a third offset, it really says that what we're underplaying in terms of a strategic thrust is speed. We've got to be better at that. Commercial world is all over that. We used to talk about when I was leading Symantec or Quantum, fast cycle time. How do we do whatever it is we're doing, including the decision making, on a faster cycle? And that's something we need to appreciate a lot more in the military, rather than just have we followed a process of requirements, acquisition, fielding that is so cumbersome and takes so long. We've got to have a premium on how fast did we do it. And that's really what the combatant commanders are asking for. If you talk to Admiral Aquilino, which Michele and I have done, he says, I want what you can get me in 1 to 2 years. His time frame is not 10 years. I may need to fight tonight. What am I going to have that's ready? So speed really has to be much more in our thinking.
Yeah. So, on this concept of speed and agility, Mike, you've developed this fast follower strategy over the past few years. What do you think are the institutional barriers to that? Is it culture? Is it power centers around how money is allocated to weapon systems? Is it planning processes? Is it sort of the lack of a person responsible for this? What do you see as those obstacles?
Well, you just named them. We have to recognize that this is important enough for us to develop a complementary process within the department to ingest these commercial technologies. And part of that process means we have to decide who's going to be responsible for these commercial technologies, like commercial satellite imagery, like drones that are being used so effectively in Ukraine. These were not designed for a service. So we're used to it, the Department of Defense, aircraft, okay, Air Force is going to decide how many we're buying. Of course, aircraft are used by other services too, but just using that as an example, maybe ships would be a better one. The Navy is going to be in charge. We haven't decided for these commercial technology who's responsible for evaluating and buying it. And you have to decide that up front for technologies that weren't designed for the military. With that assignment, and nothing's in our way, the department could decide this and determine an executive agent or organization that's responsible. Then the capability could be developed for rapid evaluation of what's available. We're doing this, had done it in the Defense Innovation Unit for the last couple of years with autonomy, with small drones. In fact, there's a Blue UAS program to ensure that we are using the right cyber-hardened drones with components made by US or allies, so it's compliant with NDAA as an example. once you decide who's responsible, then you can figure out how do I assemble the team of capable people to assess that on a commercial level of refreshing and the budget. So you were alluding to this a minute ago when you talked about, how do we get some of these capabilities more quickly? Yeah, the money has to move more quickly than it has. Taking 2.5 years to program $1 of spending at the Department of Defense is just not competitive if we're going to compete with China. So I often think about what we need to go along with the fast follower strategy is capabilities of record. If we decided instead of programs of record where we're going to have one requirement, one vendor, and we're going to field that for 40 years, we know we're going to need ongoing capabilities like autonomy, like commercial satellite imagery. If we decide who's responsible, they have a team that can assess that, and we give them an ongoing budget, not for the same vendor, but to make sure we provide the refreshed capability on a commercial cycle of refreshing. Then we could be fielding much more current technology to warfighters at the same pace that the commercial capabilities become available. We need to be thinking about the department much more as an iPhone consumer, where we go out and refresh that at a reasonable rate, and there's not a long tail of sustainment. That doesn't apply to everything we buy, but it can apply to a lot more than we're doing today. That would certainly help us modernize the department faster and get better capability to warfighters' hands.
And the human element of this is key. I mean, if you want this kind of change of behavior, more risk tolerance, moving more quickly, just working differently, you've got to change how you train people, how you incentivize and reward people, how you recognize them, how you promote them. You really need to have a separate cadre that is developed for this work, because trying to ask people who've been trained in a totally different system with a totally different risk profile and totally different reward system, it's the behavior is foreign to them. And not to blame them. They're very professional at what they've been taught to do and awarded to do. This requires a different subcadre of people who are really trained to do this agile development and procurement work.
Yeah, Michele highlighted in a previous Foreign Affairs article, maybe that's about a year ago now, this concept of green berets of acquisition. So how would we have some acquisition professionals who are trained in just what we've been talking about here? The different method of I'm going to assess things more quickly. I'm not using the FAR. I'm using other transaction authority. But how do I have folks who've specialized in that become very good at it or comfortable with that? That can create a change in culture in the department, and we definitely need more of that to make this strategy reality. The interesting thing is the only thing that stands in our way of implementing this is our ability to say yes, it's important. Let's go get it done. The one thing where the department would need some help from Congress is the more flexible allocation of dollars. The rest of it, the department could do itself. But then we would need to go to Congress and say, okay, for some part of the budget, we're going to need the flexibility to address emerging threats and take advantage of new opportunities that we find through technology development that we wouldn't have known about 3 years ago when we started the planning process for the budget. That's where we would need Congress's help.
And just one quick note on that, Mike, I think sometimes when people hear the word flexibility, it sort of sounds like an abdication of oversight. But at least for me, I think no, there's a different model of oversight that accompanies it, right? It might not look like a Gantt chart with milestones of, I will deliver this capability by this date. It might be other measures of performance or effectiveness of the what is our user feedback, if that's what we're doing, or there's another model of oversight that goes along with it. It feels to me like it's not a choice of oversight versus no oversight. That's a false dichotomy. It's like, no, it's a different lens. Let's flip this on the side, but for this portion of funding.
Yeah, completely transparent. We can share exactly what we're working on, spending dollars on. But how about some feedback from Admiral Aquilino and the other combatant commanders on how rapidly we're providing new capability that he finds useful? That's probably more relevant than having all of the decisions made by a congressional staffer on a committee, making the trade-offs of what different capabilities or platforms do we want to field. That's the way we're doing it today. And I would go further and say, again, the lesson from the corporate world, if as a CEO, if the board of directors were telling me, well, okay, you're going to put a plan together for what we're going to spend 3 years from now, and you're not going to change any of it unless you come back and ask for it line by line, you'd be laughed out of every boardroom in the country. No one would try and do it that way because we can't predict the future so clearly. Why haven't we learned that lesson in government? We're just doing it the way we have been. And unfortunately, the way we have been is an era when we did not have peer adversaries. So we've been, for a generation, so used to not being challenged from a military capability standpoint. We haven't adapted our processes to say, well, it's a different era now. We have to be competitive with what Xi's regime is doing. We're not a unipolar power the way we were after the Berlin Wall fell.
Michele, you talked a little bit about different incentives and different organizational incentives, presumably around changing behaviors. What are some of the places that you see leaders taking risks and maybe driving into difficult change? Are there places we can look for? I mean, you already highlighted SOCOM. Are there places that we can look for as models to emulate? We can try to amplify or multiply that across the department as we look to build this effort out.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of examples. I think the current Commandant of the Marine Corps is certainly sticking his neck out and taking risk to try to push the Corps to rethink its how it will operate effectively in a future environment that will be very, very different than the environment it's been working in for the last 20 plus years. So that's an example of a senior leader who's taking on a lot of risk to try to push in a new direction. But I think oftentimes it's much more, what I'm talking about is more mundane. So I'll give you a small example from my time as undersecretary. We started a human capital strategy, really wanted the supervisors to reinvest in their people and get them to training and professional development opportunities. I got lots of head nodding and yes ma'ams, but zero action for several months. And then I finally figured out that if I changed the performance evaluation criteria and you couldn't get the highest rating unless you got a certain percentage of your people to training that year, that might get, lo and behold, hundreds of training requests later. I mean, that slight change in performance evaluation criteria for the supervisors, suddenly it mattered to them. It mattered to their evaluation, to their career progression, to their next job, their next promotion, and it changed behavior. So sometimes it's really thinking about how do I take what is the behavior I'm trying to get at, and how do I bake that in down to the individual level? We wonder, certainly at the leader level, but even down to the staff level to get the behavior change that I'm looking for.
Yep. The call to action of your article, right, revolves around the themes that we've talked here. I think your words are, it's a focused DoD-wide effort. It is focused on, at least initially, on the theater of the Indo-Pacific, on challenges of deterring aggression with respect to Taiwan. We've talked about a lot of the elements that we might want to look at, but if you really had to boil that down to actions that legislators can take, that leaders in military services can take, or leaders in the department can take, what's your advice to them? What are the ways that they can move the needle around this vision that we collectively see emerging?
I would love to see a combination of the president and the Secretary of Defense and the chairman say, this is high priority, urgent problem. This is where we are. This is where we want to be. And we're going to empower a set of people to really drive this process. We're going to back them up and provide top cover, whether it's inside the building or on the Hill. And we're going to have a set of metrics that we are judging our performance by, and we are going to meet regularly and hold people accountable for whether we're making progress. to me, that's the only way you get there in the time that we have. I still think it's a doable do. I still think that we have the better hand to play than China, but we got to start playing our cards better.
Yeah, I would come back to if Michele outlined the what of what we would be trying to do, the how is we have to emphasize speed. The time frame means we've got to do things differently if we're going to deliver in a 2024 to 2027 time frame. Just having that as the overarching principle means you're going to have to do things differently than we've done. You can't take 9 to 26 years to get new capability. And so if Michele set the objective of this is going to be a priority from the president on down, we will deter China. And now you need to do things that happen in a much faster time frame. Then I think we're going to get the right behaviors and actions to make it reality.
And, without being overly dramatic, I really believe this to be true. We are in this very consequential and unusual period where, with the Russia-Ukraine situation as it is, and the risks of escalation there, and the prospect of Chinese aggression vis-a-vis Taiwan, potentially within a 2 to 5 year time frame, it's really imperative that each of these situations could escalate into a world war. I mean, the stakes could not be higher. We are actively managing one, but we have got to prepare and hopefully deter that second. And that's how important and urgent this is. And I think if people see it in those terms, I don't know a military professional or a civilian defense official or a national security person who's not going to want to say, wow, I want to be part of solving that problem. We've got to get after this now.
Yeah. I think that's compelling. As we wrap up our discussion, are there any other closing thoughts or topics that we didn't hit that either one of you would like to raise?
I would just say this is what Michele outlined is eminently within our capability and our power to do. We just have to have the will to say, this is important, let's go do it. And I think that's the kind of the closing statement of the article is the clock's ticking. The key period is between now and whatever time period you want to think. She could be making that call, but it's not a long period of time. So the premium is on what action we take now.
Well, with that, I thank you both for your time. I personally think of no more interesting subject area than what you're doing. Right, we're mixing the most important things. Right, we're mixing this topic of deterrence in an information age with globalized technology and a peer competitor. We're mixing these gaps, these seams in our institutional processes. We have a sense of urgency. And there's this tremendous opportunity space, right? It's not just doom and gloom, as you said, Mike. I mean, we have the pieces in front of us, right? If we can muster the will and the right organizational construct, right? There's a new world of opportunity available, new kinds of military capability, new forms of surprise to unveil. That I for one find really exciting. So thank you both very much for joining us, and thanks to our audience and the production team at Hudson for pulling this off.